Hello, Morem here. Today I want to show you the strongest lightning or even spellcaster build in the game. It deals absurd amounts of damage, absolutely obliterates bosses, can off-screen enemies even around corners, and can even run out of trouble very easily. I previously blessed you with the electric slide build and wanted to make something more caster oriented. And today is the day. I present you the Thunder God build. Now a quick overview. The footage you are seeing is on a level 82 Druid electrocuting his way through the variety of content, mainly 37 to 40 nightmare dungeons. I will include extended runs at the end of the video showcasing multiple difficulties. As you can see, I'm completely obliterating them without any trouble. The damage is obscene and I'm clearing very comfortably. Sure, I am not hitting for millions with each strike, but I don't have to. As a wise man once said, why do one big cut when small can do the trick? The bigger the group, the bigger the number stack. You can even target enemies off screen, making this one very safe even for the hardcore difficulty. Especially when you scale down the tiers to a lower level, like 5 or 7 levels above your character. Now what about bosses? Those get fried like chicken at KFC. I'm confident you can insta-skip pretty much any boss in the game, except for the pinnacle one. Bosses that summon ads are even more hilarious to watch, with you exploding them and their companions in a wave of electric balls. Now the only drawback of this build, you are a bit slower than any trample build. You also lack another source of unstoppable, so you have to be a bit more careful and mindful of your surroundings. There are also quite a few mods on the nightmare sigils that are painful to deal with, like less critical strike damage, less lightning damage, less vulnerable uptime and enemies sucking up your spirit like savages. Next I will quickly go through the gear, then the spirit boons, Skilltree and the Paragon at the end. There are 2 Paragon boards in the description box with one optimized for leveling up to 75 and one at 100 with high level glyphs in mind. Next, let's have a look at the gear. For the helmet, I'm looking for life on kill, because this helps quite a lot with sustain. We don't have any other way to do so. So this one is great to have. We want as much armor and damage reduction as possible. For this one, total armor rocks. I also go for maximum spirit here, but I would prefer to have maximum dexterity, intelligence or willpower, because I need those for the thresholds in my Paragon board. And for the damage resistance, I'm currently rocking on this one. I don't want this to have here. I would much rather prefer something like cooldown, reduction or the maximum spirit. As for the imprint, I'm running Cyclone Armor because it also provides physical damage reduction, which is quite nice to have. It is not dependent on the enemy level, so I can run high level content without getting one shot constantly. As for my armor, I want as many damage reductions as possible. So damage reduction versus close, damage reduction versus distant, damage reduction versus fortified is very strong. I really want to have this one on here, but I didn't roll it. And I would prefer to have a higher maximum life roll here. This one is on the low end, but more maximum life means you're less likely to get one shot. So a very nice one to have on this one. As for Mending Stone, the aspect on this one, it increases the duration of Earthen Bulwark by 6 seconds, which is quite nice to have, but the replenishment of this one is quite low. And I'm currently also having trouble keeping this one up, because enemies deal so much damage. So the pens are next, which have damage reduction versus distant, damage reduction while fortified, so as many of those as possible. And I have ranks to Hurricane. Doesn't matter really, you can do whatever you want here. Damage reduction, health, stats, whatever you want is great. I rolled with this one because I really liked the damage reduction, the flat one and the distant one, so those pens looked really good for me. Next I have this imprint for more armor, depending on how many hits I deal. But I found this one quite hard to keep up with, especially during boss fights. I'm not having as much fun with this one. Basically, I cannot stack this one up during boss fights and single target fights. So I'm looking for something else instead, which brings me to this one. Whenever I see an enemy, I get a bonus on my Earthen Bulwark. My Earthen Bulwark currently has a few ranks in, so 63%. So if I have this one stacked to the max, with this implicit specifically, I can get this one to over 120% damage absorption. So basically it doubles my health pool. So it can absorb 2 hits during the duration. It is safer to have, and I can have the unstoppable buff for longer. So I would much rather prefer this one over the armor currently, but I don't have any pants that are even close to this good, so I'm using the armor one. So next let's have a look at my gloves. My gloves currently have as much crit as possible, same with crit against injured enemies. I also have ranks on Lightning Storm, which is also essential, and I have a dead modifier, the slow one. For this one I would prefer to have either intelligence or dexterity. Both are needed for the Paragon board to get the thresholds right, and dexterity increases also the critical strike chance. So a win-win, get as much crit as possible and ranks to Lightning Storm on this one. As for the imprint, I would much rather go with the overcharged aspect. A 774 item power one is sadly not the best you can get, because when we look at the Occultist and go into the Codex of Power, class only, weapon, and look for the overcharged one right here, you can see a 10% chance to deal 4125 damage. This one is not dependent on the item level, but is dependent on the character level, meaning this aspect is garbage. Even at 20%, the other one deals basically double the damage. So you can just use the aspect in the Codex of Power. And you can put this one on your gloves and start blasting. If it procs on bosses, you're going to deal extreme amounts of damage. This one basically triples or even quadruples your damage. It's so good. But I don't have a pair of gloves, I can put this one on. As for the weapon, which is the next one, I would want to put the Lightning Dancer aspect on this. But the best one I currently have is this one, which is a sacred one, and the damage is quite low. So I cannot really use my weapon with an aspect right now. I have the Hurricane one, but this one is basically useless. So I don't have an aspect on this weapon and I'm still rocking everything. Now, looking at the weapon, go for as many multipliers as possible. I have Lightning Critical Strike damage, Willpower, which is another multiplier to your damage. When we look at Willpower in our stat sheet, we see there is a skill damage increase. This skill damage increase is multiplicatively with all other sources. So you want willpower on your main weapon as much as possible. Next we want vulnerable damage, which is another multiplier. This one is additive to the 20% you apply. We have the exploit glyph, which applies vulnerable to all targets with strike before we calculate the damage. And we have around 185% vulnerable damage, so our multiplier is very, very high whenever we hit and crit a target. Next, let's have a look at my boots. I have spirit cost reduction, which is quite nice to have. I wouldn't prefer anything else. I have movement speed on those, flat movement speed. I have willpower on those. I would prefer something like dexterity or intelligence because we can get willpower on something else. For the last mod, I would prefer movement speed on elite kills. As for the imprint, go for the unstoppable one. I have a max roll here, so 25% movement speed. And you move freely through enemies. However, there is something you can do with this build. You can go with Windstrider aspect. This one only gives you 16% at max, but it can go up to 6 seconds, and this one is basically up all the time, because we are critting constantly. What I found to be a problem with this build is we don't have constant uptime on Earthen Bulwark, so the debate is uptime on movement speed. Personally, I think this one is still better because you can move freely through enemies, so you can reposition much better and much easier. You are not getting stuck on enemies and can just run out of a group of enemies that swarmed you. So I personally prefer the Ghostwalker aspect, but this one, the Windstrike aspect, is also viable. As for your amulet, I went with the natural balance aspect on this one. I will talk about the aspect first because of the crit. The more crit we have, the more consistent our procs with Earthen Might, which I will be talking a bit about later. The critical strike damage on Earth skills is basically useless, so we are only looking at the critical strike chance increase. We are constantly using Earth Spike to generate more Earthen Might procs, to generate more spirit, to proc our resonance buff. This one is up all the time. We have 17% more critical strike chance. As for the FXS, go for movement speed, go for ranks in wild impulses, because wild impulses, I will show you before I talk about this one. When we go to the skill tree, we see wild impulses here. This one is a multiplier to our damage at the expense of more spirit cost. Our lightning storm costs basically nothing, so we have 15% increased damage on the amulet, which is amazing. One of the best passives you can get. Then we have damage reduction by fortified. And we have ranks to defensive skills. Ranks to defensive skills increase our damage reduction from Cyclone Armor and increase the barrier from Earthen Bulwark. So both of those are nice to have. I think the amulet here is nearly perfect. I wouldn't change much about this one. Next, let's move to the rings. First, the perfect one. This one has vulnerable damage, which is a multiplier, lightning damage, critical strike chance, lightning critical strike chance. So a near perfect ring. I wouldn't change much about this one. The lightning damage is essential because they nerfed the glyphs, so we want as much increased damage as possible on our other stuff. As for the imprint, go for Earthen Might as a keystone passive to apply to your storm skills, so we can proc this one with our lightning storm, with our cyclone armor, with our hurricane. I would not put this one on anything else, just the ring. Easiest to get right with low item power. And then there is another one. Let's compare those, because the vulnerable damage is on both. So this one has the same top end as this one. So a 782 item power legendary aspect ring has the same stats as this one. So you're completely fine with a low item power ring. So this one has the same stats, except crit strike damage with werewolf skills is completely useless for this build. So you would prefer something like critical strike damage with lightning damage or with just regular damage. Doesn't matter. And for this one, we are rocking Umbral. So whenever we crowd control an enemy, we are replenishing our spirit reserves. This can happen with the slow on Hurricane. This can happen with Cyclone Armor. This can happen with the stun on Earth Spike, and this can also happen on the knockback on Cataclysms. And additionally, we can also immobilize targets and get this one to proc. So basically all our spells can benefit from this one, so it's a must-have on this build. You can roll a lower level one, but this one will be essential for the build to function at a basic level, since otherwise we are going to have a lot of spirit generation problems. Next, let's go over the spirit boons. For the deer, go with wariness. This one reduces the damage from elites, very nice to have. Next one we want Avian Wrath for 30% more critical strike damage. Next one we want 2 spirit boons in the wolf. Energize is the first one. This one gives us a 15% chance to restore 10 spirit with all our damage, which is nice to have because we want as much spirit generation as possible. And then we go with Calamity, because this one extends the duration of our ultimate, which is Cataclysm. So we have a 14.35 second long storm, which is quite nice versus bosses. It constantly reapplies vulnerability and deals quite a lot of damage to them. And then we want Calm Before the Storm, because this one has a slight chance on all our damage to reduce the cooldown of our ultimate skill. Next, let's go over the abilities. We want to use Earth Spike, because this one is immediate. You can spawn it underneath enemies, it can hit multiple enemies, it can stun. So it is fast, it regenerates our spirit in a manner that is preferable to Wind Shear, because Wind Shear is very slow, and we don't want to use Storm Strike because we don't want to go into melee range. We want to stay back, we want to use the distant increases to our damage. Then we max out Lightning Storm, go for the Immobilize one, because this one is an 8% chance on every single hit of this one to proc. This one is not dependent on the lucky hit chance, because this one doesn't have the lucky hit chance tag. Then we go for Wild Impulses for increase to our damage, a massive increase to our damage, because this one is a multiplier. Go for Earthen Bulwark and the Fortified here, because the Fortifier will help us a bit with survivability, and the Earthen Bulwark can also give us Unstoppable, so a very strong spell to have. Next we want Cyclone Armor. This one combines defenses and utility 1, because when we use this one, enemies are knocked back, and they are slowed, and they are also getting the vulnerable status. So this one increases our damage, and makes us so enemies are not constantly swarming us. We can knock everything back and run out, which is very handy to have on this build. We also want to have Vigilance, because we gain 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds after using Earthen Bulwark or Cyclone Armor. In the companion cluster we want Nature's Reach. This increases our distant damage by a multiplier, and is doubled when we slow, immobilize, knockback or stun our enemies, which we do all the time. Then we pick up Hurricane, because Hurricane can also apply vulnerability. This one applies not as a lucky hit, so the lucky hit modifier here is irrelevant for this one. It's a 15% chance to apply vulnerable on enemies per tick. Very strong to have. We also slow enemies, so we can use Hurricane, run through enemies and regenerate our spirit due to Umbral. We want to have Elemental Exposure for a chance to apply vulnerable. We want to have Endless Tempest to increase the duration of our Hurricane and our Cataclysm. Bad Omen is also very nice to have, because it applies to all damage versus vulnerable, immobilized to stun targets, which we do all the time. It is a substantial increase to our damage, so make sure to pick this one up. And then we go for Electric Shock. Electric Shock immobilizes targets, but if the target is already immobilized, the lightning damage they receive is increased by 18%. This is a multiplier and is extremely strong on this build. Then we go for Cataclysm. Cataclysm is used whenever you fight very tough enemies, when you fight a lot of enemies, when you fight bosses. So pick this one up also to get a vulnerable status on our bosses constantly for the whole duration. One thing about this build is you want to have constant uptime on vulnerable damage. We have a lot of modifiers that benefit from this. We have 185 vulnerable damage right now. So our damage is basically cut by 2/3 if we are not targeting a vulnerable enemy. So we want as much as possible. And then we pick up this whole cluster. As for resonance, whenever we use our Earth Spike, we can also use our Lightning Storm. So we can apply the 18% increase to our damage, the multiplier to our damage, whenever we regenerate a little bit of spirit. And as for the Keystone passive, Earth Might, we have a legendary aspect that applies this one to our Storm skills. It restores all our spirit, which is very nice to have on this build, and guarantees critical strikes. The chance to apply this one is increased by critical strikes. You want, despite the previous fact, as much crit as possible to proc this one. And you want to immobilize, knockback or stun targets whenever you can. This will ensure that Earth Might consistently procs. Cyclone Armor is very strong for this because it has a lucky hit chance per hit. So if you hit a lot of enemies, you have a high chance, because it knockbacks target, to apply Earth Might. And lastly, the Paragon Board. For this one, I'm currently transitioning to the 100 board. I will publish two, one for 75 and one for 100, because you want immediate power when you get to the Torment difficulty. If you go for the glyphs first, you're not going to have enough power and will die or not deal enough damage in the Torment difficulty. Now, let's go over the first glyph. The first glyph is essential for this build. This one is the Spirit glyph. You want to have this one in the starter board because you can get 25 dexterity very easily just through pathing here. And this one increases our critical strike damage with core skills. And the bonus is whenever we crit, we deal more damage to them. So very nice to have. Next we path to the gate and get the Constricting Tendrils board, but we don't pick up Constricting Tendrils. We want to pick the Exploit glyph here. Pick up Nature's Will, pick up Courage for a bit more health and vulnerable damage because of those nodes here. Dexterity, vulnerable damage. This one is already level 15, so I have a radius of 4, so 49 dexterity in the radius. So our vulnerable damage is increased by 30 at the moment. This one gets up to, I think, 40%, so a very strong glyph to have, a massive damage multiplier, and the bonus is what enables this build to function. You apply the vulnerable status to every enemy you damage. And this one is applied before the damage calculation takes place. So you're multiplying your damage by the vulnerable damage all the time. And you also get the benefit from the Thunderstruck node here. This one increases the critical strike damage versus vulnerable or immobilized targets. We get this one very late, basically at the end from the pathing, but it increases your damage tremendously. So we path through here and get Ancestral Guidance, because Ancestral Guidance will proc all the time. We are spamming our Lightning Storm, so the 75 spirit spent is immediately filled up. We increase our damage by 30% for 5 seconds, and this one has an uptime of nearly 100%, so we are basically always dealing 30% more damage. Those nodes here, the Spirit on Kill nodes, all of those are essential for this build, so you want to beeline to this point. Will make the build very nice to play. All of those nodes also increase your maximum spirit, which is nice because Earth Might refills our spirit reserves. And we then path through those to get a little bit more maximum spirit. We path through here and ignore this glyph slot. We don't want to pick up Hubris yet. So go through this one and beeline the Thunderstruck node. Afterwards, fill out Tempest, fill out Deluge, and then fill out Hubris. Hubris decreases the damage enemies deal to you when they are vulnerable. With this node, we are increasing the effectiveness of rare nodes in range, so we increase the effectiveness of the damage reduction. Currently, it is not possible for us to get the bonus because we need a level 15 Keeper glyph. There is not enough intelligence currently in the range here, so we have 7 here, 5 here, 5 here, and that's it. The other nodes, 5 here, 7 here, 5 here, 5 here. All of those are outside the range, so you want to pick this one up and level this one up as soon as possible. This one will give you a 10% multiplier to all your damage. There is a few branches I have expanded to. Those give you a lot of increases to damage. So I picked this one up because you want as many increases as possible from the Paragon Board. This will scale our damage more than the multipliers at this point. And I'm currently pathing through here to get this glyph slot. And you can get Harmony to core skill damage. We then path through here, down here, and can grab up Spirit Power. Then we remove those points, and we're golden. Because we need a level 15 glyph here to get those dexterity nodes at the outer edge. Without the level 4 glyph, we are probably not going to use this glyph slot. so it's wasted points and we want to get to Thunderstruck as soon as possible. So the level 100 tree will include this glyph slot, and the level 100 tree will expand on this one, will expand on this one, will expand on this one, grab those. So just a few modifiers around this tree. The base tree will look the same. Anyway, that concludes the build. I hope you liked the video. If you do, leave a like, leave a sub, leave a comment. This one is a caster build, specifically only using the lightning and storm casting abilities of the Druid. I haven't seen one yet, so I wanted to promote this one. It's very strong. It's probably one of the strongest builds in the game currently. It also looks amazing and feels amazing to play. So again, make sure to leave a like, leave a comment and subscribe, because this one helps promote the channel, helps promote the video, and helps me out a lot. So see you next time and bye.
I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I do not have enough spirit. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet.